Hello, this is Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. Thank you very much for joining us today. We've got a really exciting program that I'm very much looking forward to. So for those who are new to the organization, the Alliance is an educational nonprofit supported by our members, people like you who want to see high-speed trains in the United States. We strive to be the most knowledgeable independent source of what high-speed rail is, why we need to build it in the United States, and what we can do, what local leaders can do to make it happen. And then we provide people like you and local leaders the tools they need in order to educate their leaders in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. So we have long advocated for what we call the integrated network approach, which is where we, instead of looking just at individual city pairs, which is the way that high-speed rail has been promoted for many decades, in order to get to the true value of what high-speed rail can do, you really need to think about networks. So not only from big city to big city, but stops in between and connecting services so that a single high-speed line impacts positively an entire region, not just a couple of big cities. In order to do this, you need to think big picture, and you need to think about 3 different types of track working together in different ways in order to serve regions and eventually connect the entire country. So shared use is where passenger trains are sharing with freight trains, preferably no faster than 90, though there's some cases where they're talking about 110. This ends up being probably about 80% of the route miles, gives you a lot of geographic coverage. Regional lines, where you're taking existing lines and focusing them on frequent passenger trains. The longest example of this in the United States is the Northeast Corridor between Washington, New York, and Boston. There's also an exciting regional project underway today between San Jose and San Francisco. And then what really brings the juice to the party is the high-speed lines, where we're adding segments, probably in the 150 to 300 miles per segment range, where trains are going 200 plus miles an hour. And this allows you to really change the dynamics by having both a high level of frequency that you can't achieve otherwise, and speed. And by connecting as part of this network, you really change the travel time for everybody. But again, to do this, you can't just look at big cities. You have to look at networks. So for example, you know, there's probably a good case for high-speed rail between Chicago and Indianapolis, but you can't really quite get there just on that case alone. There's also been discussions about Chicago to Milwaukee and Chicago to Rockford, etc. And because we haven't really thought of it as a big integrated network, none of them quite gets over the limit. But if you think about how you can connect between them, now all of a sudden you can use this system to travel between all these places. You have a lot more opportunity to use this system. And because that piece in the middle has so many people using it, you can truly justify the 200-mile-an-hour service. And you've cut the travel time for everything in the system by just building that 180 miles in the middle. So the question is, how do you do this? It's complicated. And that's why we're excited to have our program on today to talk about how they've done this in a couple of different places. And I'll introduce Chris Ott, our Deputy Director in Madison, in order to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for being here. And if you have questions during the course of the presentation, please, of course, feel free to hang on to those until the end. I'll be helping to get the questions to our speakers. And you can also, if you don't want to hang on to them, you can put them into either the Q&A feature or into the chat. But first, of course, comes the presentations from our two speakers today. Rick and I have had the chance to speak with them a bit in advance. They have a very interesting and thorough presentation ahead. First, we have Mr. Jorge Rios, who is an electronic engineer with a master's in project management and who is certified by the Project Management Institute. He started his career as a signaling and train control engineer. And during his 27 years of experience since then, Mr. Rios has directed railways and mobility projects in the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Germany, and the United States. That has meant working for companies such as Deutsche Bahn, Bombardier, Systexa, Siemens, NEC, and IBM. Currently, Mr. Rios is Vice President of DB Engineering Consulting and Operations North America and was appointed as the Project Director of the California High-Speed Rail Authority's Early Train Operator, or ETO, in 2017. The ETO is assisting the authority with planning, designing, and implementing this country's first high-speed rail program. And then our second presenter is Mr. Stefan Royal, who also works for DB Engineering and DB Engineering Consulting and Operations North America, serving as lead transportation expert for the California Authority's Early Train Operator. He has a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Stuttgart and is a transportation planning expert whose experience includes investment grade forecasting projects, service planning, financial analysis, feasibility assessments, benefit cost analysis, as well as long-term strategic planning studies. He currently leads ridership and revenue forecasting and planning studies for his company's contract with the California Authority. And during his consulting career of 26 years, he has spent 10 of those years working in Germany and has overall worked for more than 18 years on transit and rail projects. So with those introductions, let me turn things over first to Jorge.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Rick. Thank you for having us. Let me quickly share my screen. Just 1 second. Please, can you confirm that you can see not only the screen, but also my laser pointer?
Yes, we can. Excellent.
Okay. No. So, Rick, you were mentioning that that we're going to present here some tools for high speed. Yes, many of the examples that we're going to be discussing here are related to high speed, but actually the methodologies and the tools that we're going to be presenting can also be used in different systems, not only specifically for high speed, but yes, we're going to bring a couple of examples. So we are here today just to share with you a couple of let's say the ideas and how to do benefit cost analysis in terms of optimizing, prioritizing, and measuring these costs. So let me give you a little bit of background first. In Germany, let's say that we have been having already 2 times something similar to what is the infrastructure bill here in the United States. So the first one was in the 90s, and it was called the VDE, and it was the initials for transportation projects for the unity of Germany. So you may remember that there was in the 90s, at the beginning of the 90s, there was actually two different Germanys. One a thriving economy and booming economy, and then the second one, which was having some, let's say, the disadvantaged communities because of the history that was happening. So they came with this project, as I said, in the 90s for connecting. The main goal of this one was connecting and bringing access to the opportunities to both of them. And then now, recently, a couple of years ago, Germany launched a new one, which is, as I said, the second big program, which is called now Strong Rail. And if you take a look to the main goals of Strong Rail, so basically they say for the climate, for people, for the economy, and now we're not only thinking, of course, in improving the connections inside Germany, it's also connection with Europe. If you compare these with the goals of the bipartisan law and the FRA, this is a screenshot of a webinar that was presented by the FRA like a couple of months ago. You see the targets. So you see here that we have for the climate, also for the climate, we have for the economy. Here is also for the economy. So, and then if you take a look at safety, equity, transformation, and organization, then this is of course then for the people. If I can just, as I said, compare it and very similar objectives. And then these are the maps. So here we have Berlin. Sorry for it's too small, but here is Berlin, and somehow here is Munich. And I will speak a little bit about this high-speed line. This is a picture from open rail maps. You can see here the red lines in Europe are the high-speed lines, and here we have the similar map also coming from the same application from the US. So we know what we want, but in terms of what I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we want to optimize it and we want to prioritize it. But then the question is, with our networks, where do I start to create the biggest impact in the shortest time? Of course, we have limited resources, and even that this is humongous amount of money being invested in this infrastructure. I mean, there is needs everywhere. So we want to be sure that we can find out how to create the biggest impact in the shortest time. A little bit more of background. I was also in the same webinar that from the FRA when they were explaining the new process for applying for the grants for the funding. They highlighted these. They said, well, almost all the applications that we receive in the FRA are not selected, or those that are not selected is because they have deficiencies in the narrative, in the statement of work, and in the benefit cost analysis. And this is what we would like to discuss here, mainly how can we measure and how do I improve the benefit cost analysis for my project, which is also helpful not only for getting the funding, but also for getting support from different stakeholders for my project. Why integrated network planning? So Rick, you were mentioning that this is not an island. This is not like an airline that is flying from one airport to the other one. We are part of a more complex network. And what we want to try to do with this integrated network planning is to visualize the interdependencies between the connecting services. And then, of course, it will allow me to optimize, and then I will combine a couple of things. So I will balance my rolling stock, my infrastructure, but also not always I need huge investments in infrastructure and in rolling stock to achieve let's say the additional efficiencies. So there are many things that we can do at the level of operational measures. So not everything is around huge investment in infrastructure. The second one, as I mentioned before, by doing integrated network planning, you will be able to pinpoint and to identify these key or strategic infrastructure investment who will help you finding out where to start investing the resources. And finally, as I mentioned before, so how do I measure it? How do I really put all the pieces together? And it's not only trying to measure, and this is also something that normally we do in Germany, we not only measure the benefits inside the corridor, we also measure the benefits that the changes in our corridor are creating in the rest of the network. So let me come back to this basic equation of the benefit cost analysis. So a very simplified version of this: on top, we have the ridership, and in the bottom dividing, we have the cost. So the higher the ridership, the more benefits we have, and the lower the cost, again, the more benefits that we have. So, sorry, with the ridership, empty trains are basically not generating revenue. Empty trains are not saving or not producing greenhouse gas reduction. Empty trains are not helping with the congestion relief, and empty trains, of course, are not helping the economic development. But in the same direction, ridership, it depends heavily, and this is normally the order of importance when we rerun the ridership models. the passengers react, or the humans react first to the trip time or travel time. Second, they react on the frequency. How often are we offering these our service? Then they react a lot to the connections. And here is really, really important when we do integrated planning to plan for these connections. And not only for the time that the connection will take, but how reliable these connections will be. And then finally, number 4, they of course react to the price of the ticket. In the other side, cost, when we run our models, depending of course of there is a couple of bit of difference between each project, but in general, the biggest cost, or the biggest piece, is infrastructure investment. So this is capital expenditures. The second one is how much it costs to maintain the infrastructure that I am building. Number 3, it's normally how much it costs to run our trains, how much it costs to operate. And number 4, it's the operations of these infrastructures. Of course, we need to be able to squeeze as much as we can this infrastructure, just to be sure that we have a higher ratio between benefits and cost. And again, this is of course highly depending on integrated planning. And I put here a question, the speed, because yeah, we are talking about the highest speed rail alliance. So I want to show a couple of examples why speed is also very transformational in the benefits. These numbers are figures from our operations. We have also freight, and we have different units, but these are 2019 figures of DB, and I am here just mentioning 2. We have one business unit that is called long distance high speed rail, and the other business is regional. And again, we have also mass transit and other ones, but just for the purpose of illustration. And I am using 2019 because 2020 and 21 is still a little bit distorted by the pandemic. So I think this is the most representative one for the purpose of this illustration. So in 2019, we produced 145 million train path kilometers. So this is how much we move our trains for high speed and long distance. And for the regional, we move them even much more. I mean, we a little bit more than 3 times. This is the regional trains. But take a look on the profit. For this level of production, this was the profit that was generated. So if you compare these and you make a little KPI or key performance indicator, you will find how many euros of profit are you going to be generating for every train kilometer that you are running. And if you compare the 2 things, you will see that for every train path kilometer in high speed and long distance, you get 3.3 and versus 0.9. So it's 3.5 times more profitable in our business. Of course, this is not the only reason, but again, just for illustration purposes. So in general, it's much more profitable and is one of our best business units as well. So let's try to find a little bit the explanation of why high speed is so transformational, or the speed is so transformational into the benefits. So this is famous operations equation. If you have the round trip time and you divide it by the headway, then you will find out, for example, how many train sets, the minimum number of train sets that you will need to operate your service. So let's round trip. Imagine that we are departing here from station A. We go all the way to station B, and then we come back to station A. And this is what is called the round trip time. And then the headway is the time between 2 trains. How often I want to dispatch my trains. And of course, the smaller the headway means also that you have more frequent service. So let's make a little example. Imagine that the round trip time is 120 minutes and that I want to dispatch 2 trains per hour. So I will be sending, we will have in a headway of 30 minutes. I will need 4 train sets. If now I double the speed, then I will not only be reducing the round trip, let's say in half as an example, but keeping the same number of train sets, I can now offer twice the frequency also. And remember that I was mentioning at the end the impact of these into the ridership. So twice the speed, it's providing half the trip time, twice the frequency, and by the way, same number of train sets. So this is also having a big impact in the equation. So we are not only hitting here the two first components of the ridership, but we are also here, first of all, squeezing, as I said, our infrastructure. So minimizing the additional infrastructure investment, the additional maintenance that we need to do to the infrastructure. Yes, maintaining the high speed will require higher standards of maintenance, but it's not as expensive as now have to maintain twice the infrastructure. And then the train operations, no matter what will be the speed, normally the crews and the staff that we use for operating the train is more or less similar. So again, this is why also high speed is also one of the most profitable business units of DB. This is, again, I like to give also some examples. This is one of the most successful lines of high speed. We opened it in 2017 and it was connecting Berlin to Munich. So when we opened this line, the market share for rail jumped in less than 3 months, roughly 3 months, it jumps from 23% to 46%. But when I am saying the ridership or the market share, it was not only in the line itself, it was all the additional ridership that it was bringing in all the connections. So when, let's say that's part of the integrated network planning that was done, 70% of these connecting services were modified, and with the consequences that 1.2 million passengers switch from air to rail in this corridor, in this region, and 1 million passengers switch from car to rail. So what we're trying to do in integrated network planning is, of course, let's think in the passenger, and we all need to think in the same service or the same service goal, meaning the corridor plus the connecting services. We also need to have an integrated ridership and revenue, integrated way of calculating the operational expenditures, and I will explain a little trick about this. And finally, we also need to combine integrated investment in infrastructure. With these two, what we're trying to do is optimization of the benefits, how I make an impact in the experience of the customer, in the mobility, in the revenue, greenhouse gas reduction, congestion relief. And with these two, what I am trying to do is optimization of cost, not only infrastructure, but also operations and maintenance. Let me give you a little bit of example, and I want just this is something that we normally do really to measure the benefits of the line. I think Rick, you were mentioning it a little bit in the opening remarks. Let's imagine that we have this no-build scenario. So we have the green, it's rail, the blue line is a bus connection, and we have two major cities, and then we have also here some additional connections. So let's imagine that we come with a project of building high speed here between A and B, right? And of course, when you improve here the travel time between cities A and B, of course you are improving not only the as I said before, not only the travel time, but you are also improving the frequency. So of course you can claim all the benefits, and this is normally the traditional thing that that in many projects are currently calculating. You count the benefits in your line, but here is what is happening, what Rick was mentioning. By improving here, you are not only improving the frequency and the travel time between A and B, you are also improving the travel time, sorry, between J and H or E and H, meaning that you can not only count the ridership inside your line, you can you will find out that you are generating additional ridership in the connecting services. So when you are going to demonstrate or when you are going to present your project, you can also claim a share of the improvements here. Meaning you can claim the passengers who are not only traveling inside your corridor, but starting, ending, or passing through your corridor. And even you can go beyond it. because by improving the connectivity here, most probably what is going to happen is you will find out that now you can, for attending these additional connecting services, you will increase the frequency. So even passengers, the traffic or the ridership between stations per like E and F will also be increasing because you are increasing the frequency of the service. And now let's take a little look at the bus. So here, don't be afraid. I mean, also think that you can receive a piece from others, but don't be afraid also to share, for example, in this case, your revenue with a bus connection, because by doing this, of course, you are going to give a piece of your slice to this operator, but you are going to be growing the cake, and then your slice will be, of course, even bigger. And in addition to these, even that you're giving them a slice of the revenue, you can still count as a benefit of your project the greenhouse gas reduction, because you are taking the cars or buses or planes out of the market and bringing these into the rail market. So measure of the benefits to conclude. So what we want to do is measure the change in ridership and measure the change in operations. So what you do is take the total ridership of these, of this build, and then minus the total ridership of the no build, and then you will find really the impact of your project. And the same thing, you can do it with cost. And what you could potentially find in many cases is that you will have a better cost. Remember that I was giving some examples where the cost per mile of operating some services could be better than even some regional service, like I was explaining in the case of DB. And so you could be hitting in both sides of the equation. So this sounds easy when you take a look to scenarios like these, but of course, this is much more complicated when you, depending on the size of the network, but also you can come with more benefits. And this is why we normally use tools, tools for doing these exercises. So with this, now let's integrate the next operator. So I'll hand it over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Jorge. So how do we now define that service network that Jorge was just providing an example of? So when we start thinking about defining that service network, what we typically do is, we kind of have to think back about the basics. So what's our product that we're trying to sell in the market? And that product is our seat miles. So trains having seats in them and moving from town to town produce seat miles. So when we make that, or when we put this product out on the market, we are basically making a value proposition to our customers, and we make a promise. We promise reliability and speed. We promise a given price, fares, out-of-pocket cost for that product, and we're setting customer expectations by describing what that train ride will look like. Will it have dining opportunity? How comfortable are the seats, and what's the overall travel experience. So by making that promise, we are basically putting ourselves out there trying to sell that product. So in order to define that product, obviously we need to have a rail service, a rail schedule. We, as I said, need to define that user experience. We'll need to determine the price for that trip. We'll need to look at the infrastructure that's needed to perform these services, and then obviously also understand what the cost is on our end to produce that service, and then the market will eventually react to this new product. So very important to, when we look at that from the perspective of rail travel, unlike, for instance, the airline industry, we need to look at door-to-door travel options. So access and egress to and from our stations are as important as our main part that we are trying to improve. And if we don't look at that, then we'll be missing part of that value chain, part of that promise that we make to our customers. So the convenience that trip might provide to the traveler is very important, because that they are comparing that convenience to other travel modes and options that they do have. So the tools that we then can utilize to define our service network and are pretty much these 7 tools that we listed here. So first it would be a market assessment where we're trying to understand what's the overall potential that's out there. Does it even make sense to start thinking in more detail about this area? Then the service planning and integration planning is another step where we need to understand what kind of service can we provide in the wider network context to support our future service. And then fair policy and integration, very important part to understand what the price for the customer will be eventually. Once we have all of those defined, then we can go through a ridership and revenue modeling exercise where all of these planning parameters will be put into the demand model. And then eventually we would understand what the potential ridership reaction would be to that new service or that improved service. We also need to then go through a detailed cost modeling exercise to understand what is the cost for operations and maintenance of the system as compared to a situation without putting an improvement in. And then obviously the infrastructure and capital expenditure planning that follows then, where we need to understand how can we expand the system, how can we improve infrastructure to then support that new service that we are proposing. And then last but not least, obviously the most important part is to understand the benefits versus the cost assessment and to see if our proposed improvement fits in with wider policy goals that come from various stakeholders, and we need to check whether that falls in the right category and whether we achieve these benefits. So all of that together then eventually would flow into a strategic infrastructure and service plan, not just for our service, but also for the connecting services, because at the end, everybody needs to work towards a common goal and understand how that all fits together. So from our experience and our perspective, I think the keys to success are long-term integrated plans where all partners, all operators in a wider system have a common vision that they can work towards and understand how a change in their service impacts a change or a service in riders in another service. Then an incremental implementation process, because obviously we have only limited funding, and that limited funding you're trying to stretch as far as you can to make things happen. So an incremental implementation with working towards that longer strategic plan is very important. And then in a lot of cases, if we can find one key project that we can implement early on, that can be the showcase, that success, for instance, like that Berlin-Munich example that Jorge brought up earlier, then obviously it is much easier to convince stakeholders that are on the fence about a new project or a new service to get them on board and show them that things actually work, that they do provide benefits, and that they do fall in with the wider policy expectations. So the sequencing of the infrastructure and then having the agreements in place between all the stakeholders are kind of the key to then having that, providing that optimized value chain for the various customers that we are trying to serve. So the market assessment tries typically to answer 3 key questions. Where's the market today? What are the competing modes? What's the overall demand? How will that market change in the future? Do we have new mobility providers that might come online that might take part or trying to take part of our cake? Maybe there are new options that might even supplement what we're doing and would even provide an upside to our market. And then last but not least, what are the impacts then of our proposed service improvement or our new service and our new line on that market? How much of the market can we possibly capture? Are there benefits that we envision that we can realize, and will these policies that are out there that we're working towards come to fruition, or do we maybe need to rethink our approach? So it's kind of a high level at first step towards understanding what the new system or the new service will bring. Then the service planning and integration planning would be the next step. So once we determine that we have a project that seems feasible, that seems promising, we would need to look into how does our service fit into the wider network context. What you see here on the chart is a snapshot out of what is called Deutschlandtakt, which is a integrated service plan for the entire country of Germany. It's basically a huge map, a big sheet of paper where all the services that are depicted. It shows the service frequency, and it shows at these gray hubs when trains arrive, when they depart. So here a little zoom in for one of the stations there. The red lines are intercity and long distance services. Blue lines are interregional or intercity services, and then the green ones are local or regional services. So without having to have a tabular timetable, you can literally take this map. You can understand at which minute that train departs at your origin station. You can follow the line along, you know which station you have to transfer at, and then eventually you'll see which minute you're arriving in the destination station. And this planning is very systematic, so that it really helps the customer understand the service in a very easy way. So again, back to our product, we're selling seat miles. It's a very perishable product. We only collect revenue if that seat is sold, if that seat is occupied. When we can turn over that seat very often or in a very frequent manner, and we can turn over a lot of our seats, then we have a high productivity. It's more cost effective. And as I said earlier, by definition, we are not only selling the seat miles on our product, we are also selling seat miles on the connecting partners products. So very important to understand that we basically are, when you work in an integrated network, you can't just focus on your own product. You need to think about beyond the borders. You need to think across operator lines to understand what impacts are there for the customer. This systematic service planning for all operators is typically done with using pulse schedules. So pulse schedule means that a train departs at a given minute every hour from a station, say at minute 5, and travels to another city. And so as a customer, I don't even need to know, again, don't need to look up a schedule at some point anymore. I know if I want to travel to, say, Munich, for instance, and I know that the train leaves at minute 5, I can just walk to the station and say at minute 5, the next train will leave to Munich. The schedules are usually also defined as symmetrical schedules, so that in order to optimize transfers at these stations, we have the symmetry in the schedule, so that a train coming from one direction might arrive at minute 55, and then the train departing the other direction will leave at minute 5. So that symmetry is very important, because what it does is we can then define connections by design, what we call it. So planned transfers that are minimizing transfer times, instead of connections by accident, where due to the constraints in the scheduling, you might not be able to have a decent transfer situation at a given node. So very important for the integrated network planning. And then once we have that common service strategy on these parameters defined, then everybody that's involved in transporting our passengers, ourselves as well as the connecting partners, have one vision that then they can work towards, and it benefits all of the operators. Service planning is not just the only thing that we need to think about when it comes to integration. Fair policy and fair integration is very important as well. We need to provide a one-stop shop for the customer. Travel information systems, they can book a door-to-door trip on one app or on one website. They don't need to worry about having 3 or 4 different operators in between, holding a whole array of tickets in their hand when they board a train. It's really geared towards customer convenience and customer service. There's also the operator integration needed then. So obviously, Deutsche Bahn long distance services in Germany, they have yield management, like for instance, Amtrak has on the Northeast Corridor. So that needs to be considered. Then the revenue collection and allocation processes are important. And then revenue sharing agreements, as Jorge said earlier, maybe we are willing to share some of our revenue with a connecting partner, because by having that connecting partner on board, it provides benefits to our riders, and we can grow the cake as a whole. And then very important, obviously, that all of the operators need to treat that service as need to provide ownership of that service. So everybody needs to work together and towards a common understanding how to promote that service. And then also on the fare side, policy goals are very important. So discounts, means-based fares, or ways of trying to achieve changes in travel behavior that also impact the fares. So once we have all of that defined, then obviously we need to go through a ridership and revenue modeling exercise, because obviously we're looking into the future. We don't have an understanding how people will react to this. So that's why we deploy ridership and revenue models. We're looking at the expected user behavior based on historic or stated preferences that people have made, and then we are using them the model to kind of mimic the behavior of people. We look at the expected market sizes driven by various parameters, and then eventually we can estimate ridership and revenue estimates for a given system or for a given alternative. We typically do point estimates for, say, a base case situation, but then also look at ranges of estimates, because nobody in the world can exactly forecast what will happen 10, 15, 20 years from now. So sensitivity testing, alternatives analysis is a very important tool, and models are very good at comparing different scenarios. It's kind of a key advantage of using a demand model is to compare different scenarios, different assumptions, what ifs, what will happen if such thing occurs. That's a very good use of a demand model. And then also risk analysis is very important to understand. So, what are the chances that gas prices change? What are the chances that other parameters change that were assumed to be, within a certain range in the base case? And then that risk analysis can be used to inform decision makers. Same thing on the operations and maintenance cost side. We need to understand obviously what the costs to operate and maintain our service. Life cycle costs need to be evaluated. We then can look at profit and subsidy assessments. Can we make a surplus? Is there a need for public sector to subsidize the service? Fare box and ancillary revenues, and then obviously also the revenue operation can be assessed with that. And then most importantly, we can provide different viewpoints from a financial perspective for the infrastructure and asset owners, for the operators, agencies, authorities, and then also the general public or the state and other agencies. The next step would then be to assess the infrastructure and capital expenditure planning. Where do we build first? Are there constructability constraints? Where can we get early benefits? What is a potential phasing approach that would help us in an incremental fashion to implement the new infrastructure? Optimization, again, Rick alluded to that earlier. Mixed service corridors might be helpful in certain areas, or we might have to have a dedicated infrastructure in other places. How can we optimize stations so that we improve the customer experience? Because between the rolling stock and the stations, that's the kind of perception of our customers when they use our system. And then we also need to talk to our connecting partners and see if there are investments needed on their end. So rolling stock strategy, again, it defines customer experience, and then we need to also think about maybe we need to have 2 generations, 3 generations of rolling stock, where early on we might be able to utilize a more, or a smaller fleet or a different set of rolling stock. And then as the system builds out, we might have to invest in larger trains, in different fleets that serve different markets. And then obviously the question whether you own or lease and how the maintenance is performed, a lot of important questions. So after we've done all of that analysis and assessment, we need to kind of, again, question ourselves, do we hit the mark with our project? Does the project look promising from a financial perspective, from a ridership perspective? Does it fit in with long-term strategies? What are the benefits for our connecting partners? Does that uplift in the system that Jorge described earlier, does it meet expectations on their end? And can their investment also be justified? Because obviously they might have to do their own investment to get to an optimized system as a whole. Do we have the support of stakeholders? Very important, does it align with wider policies, state, federal, other policies that are in place, and can our project help achieve their goals and the stakeholders' directions there? And then do we meet wider policy expectations in general? Can we support these long-term strategies with incremental improvements? So if we can tick these boxes on the left here, then obviously we have an integrated service offer that can really go a long ways. And then you get to the point where on the right, you see the stakeholders, everybody says, yes, this is a good thing to do. Let's move forward on it. And you can start implementing and improving the system. So how do we present the project benefits? So again, we've went through this whole analytical phase. We have a no-build scenario or do nothing. Then we have a scenario with improvements. We can figure out the capital expenditures, the ridership, all the other items, and then obviously we can derive, capital, the operating cost. We can derive wider benefits from the ridership and the riders that are using our system. We can define other revenues that we might be able to obtain, and then we can, from there, calculate our surplus or subsidy. And then, as Jorge said, by looking at the delta between the build-in versus the no-build, we can figure out, is this scenario one something that meets our needs, and can we from a policy perspective, with a good conscience, say yes, this falls within our expectations, and let's move forward with it. So kind of a summary of the benefits, summary of the cost, and then we'll look at the delta and then say, yes, this looks good. So however, this only answers the question, is this one project good to go, or should we, when we don't have an answer, where do we start first? So again, we can do the same for obviously other alternatives, for subsections of our network, for kind of situations where we start dealing with this incremental approach, and then we can show these benefits for different alternatives, and then basically use that as a basis to start ranking. So we can figure, okay, based on our understanding of these benefits, these are the alternatives that fare best, that are most beneficial in certain areas, have the least cost. Other ones are more costly, have less benefits, and so on and so forth. And so with that, then we can have a very easy or compressed view of all of that analytics that goes into the assessment of that improvement. And that basically helps us then to define conclusions and then eventually make decisions. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jorge.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. So can you go to the next slide? So
sorry. I think I missed the slide here. Sorry.
Okay, don't worry. The point is, when we finish these let's call it the side-by-side comparison of these different alternatives, then of course you see what Stefan was explaining. You will find out that maybe some scenarios will be better from the greenhouse gas reduction. Some other will be better from the revenue side. So you say, well, when I am comparing, what will be the criteria that I will be using to pick up one or the other? And if you remember the first slide that I used to start the presentation, then we were having the key goals of let's call it of the investment of the infrastructure bill, if we want to call it. And I can give you an example, and this is changing in time. For example, in the 90s, the main goal of DB in Germany was connectivity for the economic development of the two Germanys that we were having. Now, strong rail has as #1 priority the climate. So, of course, there will be a higher weight on those projects that are really, really giving an impact, a bigger impact in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. Other times we could be talking about profitability. It will be also depending if it is a state-owned corridor or if it is going to be a private-owned operations. So you will need to, based on your goals, then you apply a weight of each one of these criteria that Stefan was explaining, and yeah, and then you come with let's say the rationale on weighting the different corridors. And with this, I think we are open for questions. I think we still have a few minutes. So I don't know, Rick or Chris.
Yes, thank you both. In the chat, we have thanks to both of you speakers from our audience members. We have appreciation for Germany's system, from some people who have firsthand experience with it, and of course we have at least a few questions. The first question comes from Bill. You mentioned in the course of the presentation, some references to the effect that the pandemic has had, but this question asks for a little bit more about that, about how ridership in Germany was affected by COVID, and how do things look now?
I would like to take the first shot, and then Stefan, you can help me. So there are three major things that impact, three major impacts of the pandemic into the ridership. The first one, let's call it was because people was afraid. So this is the one. This is very quickly starting to disappear. The second impact is mainly because the economy itself. So of course, all the economies are now recovering back. Takes a while, but the one that we are still currently finding out is the permanent change in the human behavior, and this is the one. So the first two more or less are already solved. The changes in the human behavior, yes, we still have less numbers. It depends on which line and which country we're talking about, but in the last numbers that we saw from the statistics, we were still between 11 and 20% below the numbers pre-pandemic in some of the lines. And of course, we have to change many of our strategies. Initially, we were having a fare policy focus a lot in let's say, monthly passes and selling like regional passes, as I said, in time. Now we have to change, say the more you travel, the cheaper it gets to you. And then we put a cap. And then after the cap, basically, you are almost able to run for free. If we want to promote those lines, we are now providing more information about real-time status of the service to the passengers, so that they can decide when to take the train. And we are also changing some underutilized, especially bus connections, for more on-demand mobilities, kind of on-demand shuttles to cover this. But I don't know, Stefan, if you want to add something as well.
Yeah, I guess you captured it pretty well. And I guess just to put things in perspective, obviously, if you look back to the 2008 recession here in the US, for instance, I think it took about 5 to 6 years, even for highway travel, to go back to where it was just from an absolute volume perspective before the downturn. And so, but contrary to, say, the past experience, I think, as Jorge said, we are now facing kind of a wider change in behavior. We'll need to see another couple of years or so to understand the full extent of how many people will continue to work from home. So what does that do for business trips? So maybe people in the past that commuted to the office might have not made as many longer distance business trips as they might be making now, where they might be living, I don't know, 1 or 2 or 3 hours away from their office. So before it was just a regular commute trip to work, and now it might be a special business trip to get to, see the team or whatever. So I think there's just this overall kind of change in behavior. I mean, if you look around the globe, everybody is trying to still figure out how to address it, and there will be definitely change in trip purposes. People might be doing more leisure trips now, since they work from home. They have that half hour or hour commute time that they had in the past. They can utilize that for making additional trips. So it's just something that I think will evolve, and we'll see. I think the TSA numbers here in the US are back to about 85, 90% almost for airlines. So I'm pretty certain that it's not the same traveler composition that we had before the pandemic. So.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question from Thomas about greenhouse gas reduction. For greenhouse gas reductions in Germany, is it more important to reduce congestion from freight trucks or to reduce regional flights in integrated corridors?
What happened, I don't know if I am getting the question right, but what happened, for example, talking about flights. I mentioned the example, for example, between Berlin and Munich. Initially, the first thought was that with the opening of this line, that the airlines will react against this competition, but it was completely the opposite. What they did is they say, well, basically they almost stop all these short distance flights, and they change it for more profitable long distance flights. So let's say there was like a kind of cooperation, and actually we have co-chairs with Lufthansa, for example. And then of course it was beneficial. So yeah, again, it will depend. One of the most critical resources especially in Berlin for many years was the airports. I don't know if you're aware of the history of these airports in Berlin, but it was one of the most critical ones. So there was basically all the regional flights between Berlin and Munich almost disappeared. So I don't know, and then and reduce the other part was more important to reduce congestion of freight trucks. We have the two things, and we have if you remember the goals that I was giving to you, we have a very high goal of reducing the number of containers which are being transported by truck. And actually we have all here it comes when there is also a legislation helping, because we have many right now many legislation which is banning the through traffic of freight by truck. So if the traffic is just crossing one of the countries, then it has to go by rail. So here is where legislature can really also help to reduce the congestion. So I don't know if this answered the question, or maybe Stefan, if you want to add something. But
yeah, I guess there's obviously in Europe attempts in trying to electrify the highways as well. There's all kinds of interesting approaches there. Obviously trying to get the emissions down from freight transport is as important as doing it on the passenger side. As Jorge said, on the reduction in flights, it's usually mostly driven by the airlines having capacity constraints at the airports. So the airports are not or at or before the pandemic at least, or over capacity. And unlike airports here in the US, you can't really have many more runways added, or even on the terminal side, things are getting pretty tight here and there. So I think it's kind of a business decision that's been made from the airlines to start thinking about having other modes as connecting modes, and then deal with code sharing and through ticketing and all these kind of things. So I think that's mostly driven on that by capacity constraints and by business models. I believe here in the US, a few airlines announced that they now will serve certain shorter flights by long distance bus. So it's kind of a similar approach here. And then, yeah, the greenhouse gas emissions is obviously, a big issue. And so without putting the freight on rail, electrified rail, you still have the majority of trucks operating as with combustion engines. So you still have that issue. So it's obviously, all of Europe is trying to work towards decarbonizing transportation, and there's various approaches in that direction.
Great, thank you. We now have a lot of questions, and I know it's the top of the hour. Are you both able to stay on a bit longer?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but let's try, and I will try to batch some of them together, our unrelated themes. Let's go with this one. Several people asked variations on this question, which is, did Germany start with what might be called cultural problems, such as a lack of communication and coordination between different agencies and stakeholders, and maybe even outright resistance? And if so, how were those problems overcome?
There is I have another presentation just for this, and we call this presentation building a high-speed line in Germany was not a pleasure cruise. Yes, it was a lot of challenges with environmental clearance, challenges with the definition of roles. So yes, as I said, it's we have challenges also of cost overruns. For example, there is also a question about subsidies. There was a question also as well how to divide the subsidies in some of the lines, because we were changing. Remember that we were changing 70% of the connections, and some of these connections were subsidized, some other were not subsidized, and then yes, so it's I think it was basically facing the same kind of challenges. Maybe, and this is also linked to the profitability or this subsidies. Maybe the main difference from the US and Germany, I think, is Germany, when they started with these programs, they declare, especially the infrastructure, the rail infrastructure was declared a national asset for economic development. So the infrastructure still like a monopoly, but we have open access. And then again, I'm trying to answer the second question as well, which is linked. We have open access policy. So we run our trains. We have a train operations business, which is the passenger business. We have a freight business, and we have an infrastructure business. We share this infrastructure with more than 350 different operators. So yeah, it's again, all the challenges were the same, and then I can share with you this. It's a nice presentation, as I said this, but yeah.
Maybe we should do that a different day.
Yeah.
Very interested.
Thank you. We have a request because you both, Jorge and Stefan, are both involved with the California high-speed rail project. We have a request for you to share your impressions of the project and how it's going at this point.
If I can, this will be my personal. I'm speaking about in this regard as Jorge, not as any of the company, just to be clear. My personal opinion, in the 5 years that I have been working in the project, even that there are still a lot of challenges, I think this is the best moment in time for this project. So there is, the authority has a building block, which is matching the available funds. There is also never, since I started in this project, I have never seen a more friendly administration in Washington toward, in these regards. And also the fact that this infrastructure bill is coming into the market also, it's creating a lot of synergies and also, especially I have seen a lot of regional partners also starting to support more and more the project. So, but again, this is my personal opinion around this.
Okay. Thank you. And Carol asks, how will you coordinate all the funding for rails considering the state and federal disconnects that we have here?
I think there's I don't know. I don't have experience in these little politics, fundings and funding here, the projects. I don't know, Stefan, maybe you have been longer here in the US, but
yeah, I guess, it's always I think the key issue is, and it's not just here in the US, it's everywhere. we're dealing with infrastructure here that's going to last 90, 100, maybe 120 years, right? Tunnels, bridges. That's heavy-duty infrastructure that we're building or trying to develop here, or trying to improve based on existing corridors. And so the issue that you have with that, building such a long-term asset, it takes a long time to build it. I mean, to give you an example, back to the earlier question, the first project I've ever worked on, I was still in college, was in 1994. That was the run-through station in Stuttgart. That's part of the European high-speed rail corridors. And just, I think, a couple of weeks ago, they had an open house of that construction. So that's a very long time frame between the initial network integration planning and when it finally gets implemented. And so with that, I think the key is that you get your stakeholders lined up, and it doesn't matter if it's just state or national or local stakeholders. And you need to work kind of towards that long-term vision, that long-term strategy. And I think the Europeans just have one key advantage there, and that is that the European Union has what they call a TEN plan, a Trans-European Network Plan, because they realized that a lot of these countries are smaller countries, and a lot of the traffic really passes through these countries. And so the European Union basically has this large framework, this large master plan that says, okay, in the next 20, 25 years, we want to develop the network. And it's not just the rail network, it's the waterways, it's the airport network, and it's the roadway network or highway network. We want to develop it in that fashion to provide the best advantages for us as a multinational society. And then each country has its own master plan and says, okay, we'll take that. These are the ends of coming into our jurisdiction, and we want to develop these corridors in our jurisdiction. And then, at least in Germany, each state has its master plan, and then that trickles down to the local and regional area. So you kind of have a long-term vision of everybody saying, this is what we want to work towards. And then once you have that vision established, then putting the funding in place, yes, it's still challenging, but it's easier to work towards that rather than somebody saying, yes, we need to invest in our network, but then obviously, yes, there's competing needs in California, there's competing needs in Illinois, there's competing needs in Florida, and wherever somebody wants to put something together to improve the public transportation system. So I think that's kind of the key difference that I see. And so obviously, the FRA does the regional rail planning studies. They've done one for the Southwest, they've done one for the Southeast, one in the Midwest. That's a very good basis. And then I think it's just, it is a tedious process, and then further developing these conceptual plans into something that's more towards an implementation plan. And yes, it takes patience and more importantly, a long-term commitment from the public, from the political side. And I think that's a really big challenge, that you get all these stakeholders behind these projects.
So you just pretty much summed up why I think this presentation is so important. So I want to thank you for that. So part of the big issue here is, how do we get a lot of stakeholders engaged in a bigger vision? And to do that, you have to understand how these services interconnect. And that's the critical piece. So as long as we focus on city pairs, you're not showing how everything interconnects, and you're not bringing in the full range of stakeholders. So, we can talk later. You guys did do this for California, and you made it clear you couldn't talk about California yet. We appreciate that. We can do that later, and how this has helped build that. And then the other important issue here that's kind of missing in this discussion is that a lot of people passing through small countries, and in our region, we've got a huge problem with that called Indiana, where most of the most important infrastructure is in Indiana, but most of the travel is going to be passing through Indiana. So how do we do that? We need to have a big picture vision that's managed by the federal government. And putting this all together is really going to be complicated. And we're excited that the state of Illinois has created a high-speed railway commission to get this process started in Illinois and looking at surrounding states. So again, I really want to thank you guys for doing this presentation. This has been very exciting. Unless Chris, I don't have the sense there's a really pressing question that's dedicated totally to this presentation.
There are a lot of questions, but I think we just won't be able to get to them all.
Excellent. I'm sorry, I'm reacting to a comment. But again, thank you guys for doing this. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we can have you back to talk about the other things, and especially that, what did you say? Building a high-speed line in Germany wasn't a walk in the park?
Was not a pleasure cruise.
It was not a pleasure cruise.
And
so
I know that there was also a lot of questions related to these subsidies. So we have, if there is something that I think at some point of time, maybe the US is going in this direction, we have also another interesting topic, which could be open access, and not only how to pay for building the infrastructure, but more how to pay for the use in a fair way between all the parties. And this is, of course, something that, as I said, I was just reading through the questions about these.
Excellent. Yes, we would love to do that. So if you liked this presentation, even if you've donated before, please go to highspeedrail.us. We are supported by membership contributions, highspeedrail.us, and hit that donate button. Thank you again for your presentation, and thank you to all for coming. We will do this again soon. Thank you.